Some texts were not forgotten. They were removed. They circulated for centuries in the Jewish communities of the Second Temple, were quoted by apostles, copied in monasteries, kept in caves in the Judean desert, read in synagogues, respected as prophetic. Until something changed, not their authenticity, not their antiquity, not their proven historical influence, but what they said. The Book of Enoch describes humankind in a way that official religious history preferred to silence. Not because the text was false, not because it was invented, but because it revealed too much about limits, knowledge, transgression, and the profound nature of the human condition. The disturbing aspect is not the supernatural creatures the text describes. The disturbing aspect is not the rebellious angels or the giants born from forbidden union. The disturbing aspect is the portrait of humanity it preserves, in the way it presents humankind not as a passive victim of external forces, but as an active agent in its own collapse. If you seek understanding and not authorized versions, if you seek historical patterns and not comfortable narratives, continue. The idea of a banned text carries immediate emotional weight, but historical accuracy demands clarity about what that truly means. Banning is not the same as forgetting. It is not the same as destroying. It is deliberately deciding that certain narratives should not circulate freely, that certain questions should not be formulated in official religious contexts, that some portrayals of reality are incompatible with the order being attempted to be established. When early Christian communities began defining the biblical canon between the 2nd and 4th centuries, the criterion applied was not merely documentary authenticity or alleged divine inspiration. It was institutional stability, doctrinal coherence, interpretive control, theological unity, texts that generated insoluble debates, that proposed cosmologies too complex to be controlled, that posed questions without comfortable answers, that demanded sophisticated interpretation, were systematically left out, not necessarily because they were heretical in the strict theological sense of the word, but because they destabilized the construction of a uniform narrative about God, humanity, sin, and salvation. The Book of Enoch belongs to this group of problematic texts. It circulated widely in Second Temple Judaism, was respected and copied by Essene communities, and is explicitly quoted in the Epistle of Jude in the canonical New Testament. This is not modern academic speculation. It is documented historical fact. The Epistle of Jude, verse 14, directly quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch, identifying him nominally as the 7th from Adam. For a New Testament author to cite a text as valid prophetic authority, that text needed to have considerable weight in the communities of the time. And it did. Fragments of the Book of Enoch circulated in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. They were read. They were studied. They were considered revelatory of truths about the origin of evil, about the nature of angels, about the coming judgment. But when the Church consolidated its official canon in the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries, Enoch was left out. In the Western Christian tradition, the text has almost completely disappeared from public circulation. It survived only in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where it remained canonical to this day, preserved in Ge'ez, the Ethiopian liturgical language. It was rediscovered in the West only in the 18th century, when the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 manuscript copies from Ethiopia to Europe. In the 20th century, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran brought to light Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch, definitively confirming its antiquity and its wide circulation in pre-Christian Judaism. The central question is not whether the text is true in a literal and historical sense. The question is why it was so important for centuries and then became so problematic that it needed to be excluded. Enoch, in the Hebrew tradition preserved in Genesis, is a profoundly enigmatic figure. The Torah dedicates only 5 verses to him, He lived 365 years, walked with God, and then did not die because God took him. This narrative brevity is intentional. Enoch does not experience death. He crosses over. He is translated. This places him in an absolutely unique position in the biblical narrative. A human who directly accesses the divine without passing through death. A mortal who enters the celestial dimension while alive. In the book of Enoch, this crossing becomes the organizing center of the entire narrative. He does not merely walk with God in a pious and abstract way. He receives detailed revelations about the structure of the cosmos, about rebellious angels and their transgressions, about the coming judgment that will purify the earth, about the precise origin of the evils that afflict humanity, and, more importantly, about the central role of knowledge in the downfall of humanity. Herein lies the core of the theological problem that the text represents. The Book of Enoch narrates in detail how celestial beings called watchers, angels charged with observing humanity, descended to earth, engaged sexually with human women, and transmitted forbidden knowledge to primitive humanity. Not just basic agricultural techniques or survival skills. They taught advanced weapon-making, the production of cosmetics and adornments for seduction, astrology, and the interpretation of celestial signs, witchcraft, and the manipulation of occult forces, the use of roots and plants to alter consciousness and reality. Knowledge that fundamentally alters the established natural order. Knowledge that grants immense power before granting corresponding wisdom. Knowledge that allows human beings to manipulate physical and social reality without understanding the chain consequences of what they are doing. And the narrative makes it absolutely clear that this generated profound and irreversible corruption in humanity. Not because knowledge is intrinsically evil in itself, but because it was granted out of due time, without adequate moral preparation, without the collective maturity to handle the power that this knowledge conferred. This is the part that genuinely disturbs religious structures. The Book of Enoch does not present humanity as an innocent victim of malevolent external forces. It does not offer the comfort of saying that evil comes only from outside, from demonic entities that passively corrupt. It presents humanity as an avid, conscious, and voluntary recipient of power. The Watchers transgressed by descending and breaking the separation between celestial and terrestrial. But humans transgressed by enthusiastically accepting and applying without hesitation what they received. The problem was not merely the unilateral action of the angels, it was the active human disposition to use destructive knowledge. The narrative of Enoch places direct moral responsibility on humanity unequivocally. The human being is not merely a passive creation that obeys or disobeys. It is an active agent in moral and social collapse. It is a conscious participant in corruption. And this human agency appears precisely at the moment when technical knowledge brutally surpasses the ethical capacity to use it wisely. This is deeper than it appears at first glance. The narrative of the fall in Genesis chapter 3 revolves entirely around a single tree situated in the center of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The primordial transgression is not merely formal disobedience to an arbitrary order. It is premature access to complete moral discernment. Eating the fruit means knowing how to distinguish good from evil, right from wrong, appropriate from destructive, before being psychologically and morally prepared to handle this distinction. Before having a developed ethical framework to sustain the overwhelming weight of this knowledge. Before having accumulated wisdom to apply it without self-destruction. The Book of Enoch dramatically expands on this fundamental dynamic. It shows that the pattern was not a unique event. It shows that it repeats itself. Knowledge granted or accessed before the appropriate time generates inevitable social collapse. And humanity, instead of rejecting or containing this dangerous knowledge, embraces it with both hands. It uses it immediately. It disseminates it rapidly. It applies it without reflection. Corruption, in this reading, does not come exclusively from outside, from external demonic forces. It stems from the explosive interaction between expanded human capacity and a total absence of internal moral limitations. Stay until the end. Because this specific narrative structure is not unique to Enoch or Genesis, it runs through multiple banned and apocryphal texts of Second Temple Judaism. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient Jewish text considered canonical only by the Ethiopian Church, explicitly reinforces the Watcher's narrative and expands on the detailed chronology of progressive corruption. It presents forbidden knowledge as a direct catalyst for escalating violence and social disintegration. It describes how post-flood generations repeated the same patterns. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in the Qumran caves, contained multiple copies and fragments of texts related to Enoch and the Watchers. This unequivocally indicates that the Essene communities, known for their moral rigidity and apocalyptic expectations, considered these narratives absolutely central to understanding the corrupted human condition. They were not peripheral stories or theological curiosities. These were texts that fundamentally explained why the world was corrupted to its core and why a radical divine judgment was necessary and imminent. In the Gnostic Gospels, systematically banned by the early Church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a structurally parallel but inverted theme appears. Knowledge, or gnosis in Greek, is presented as the very path to spiritual liberation. But liberation from what exactly? From the ignorance imposed upon one's own inner divine nature, from material imprisonment, from cosmic illusion. The problem, according to Gnostic texts such as the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Truth, was not knowledge itself, but the power structure that deliberately prevented access to it. For the Orthodox texts that won the theological and political dispute of the first centuries, this position was profoundly dangerous. It placed knowledge as an autonomous redeemer, independent of divine grace, mediated exclusively by the institutional church. It placed the human being as potentially divine by essential nature, not by externally granted salvation. This completely destabilized the entire structure of religious authority under construction. That is why the Gnostic Gospels were vehemently banned, not because they were historically false, but because they were theologically incompatible with the hierarchical order that was being consolidated. These texts are not simply competing with each other. They reveal hidden layers of the same fundamental unease. Enoch speaks of premature knowledge that corrupts. Genesis speaks of inaccessible discernment that destroys innocence. Jubilees speaks of progressive corruption that repeats itself cyclically. The Gnostic texts speak of imprisoned knowledge that needs to be liberated. They all revolve around the same irresolvable tension. Is humanity truly ready for what it knows? What happens when technical capacity brutally and rapidly surpasses moral capacity? What occurs when brute power exceeds accumulated wisdom? These are not abstract questions. They are questions about observable historical patterns. Few reach this point in the analysis, but it is here that the narrative becomes genuinely disturbing. Because the pattern described was not confined to the distant past. It is not exclusive to ancient texts or archaic religious traditions. It describes something structurally recurrent in documented human experience. Every time radically new knowledge emerges, every time technology dramatically expands the capacity for action, every time power becomes accessible without corresponding ethical preparation, the same fundamental tension reappears. The Watchers in the Book of Enoch taught advanced metallurgy. Lethal weapons were immediately forged. They taught astrology and the reading of celestial signs. Destinies were manipulated, and anxiety about the future was institutionalized. They taught sorcery and the manipulation of occult forces. Social realities were distorted, and power was concentrated. And humanity, faced with each new piece of knowledge, instead of rejecting it out of caution, applied it immediately, used it without reflection, disseminated it without control, until collapse became inevitable and irreversible. The escalation is unsettling because it doesn't depend on literal belief in rebellious angels or giants born from forbidden unions. It functions perfectly as an observable structural pattern. Knowledge without corresponding wisdom breeds social corruption. Power without developed ethics breeds systemic violence. Technical capability without moral limits generates destruction on an ever-increasing scale. The Book of Enoch was banned not because it described improbable, fantastical creatures. It was banned because it depicted humanity in a way that was radically inconvenient for religious institutions, as a species fundamentally capable of self-destruction, as a structurally flawed moral agent, as a compulsive and power-hungry recipient that doesn't know how to use it sustainably. This description did not comfort faith communities. It did not inspire simple, obedient devotion. It did not allow for a linear narrative of easy and automatic redemption. It demanded constant confrontation with something profoundly uncomfortable: direct and inescapable human responsibility in civilizational collapse itself. Save this for the end, because the text of Enoch doesn't simply end with collapse and destruction. It narrates the subsequent divine judgment. The Watchers are captured and imprisoned in subterranean abysses until the final judgment. The earth is purified by the flood. Cosmic order is temporarily restored. But the restoration doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't reverse the knowledge already transmitted. It doesn't remove from the collective human memory what has been irreversibly learned. The judgment contains the immediate corruption, but it doesn't eliminate the cultural memory of what happened. It doesn't eliminate the human capacity to repeat the pattern. And this preserved memory becomes a permanent warning for future generations. The text of Enoch functions, within its own internal narrative structure, as a permanent reminder that certain limits exist for reasons that completely transcend arbitrary religious moralism. They exist because crossing them generates catastrophic consequences that humanity collectively is not prepared to face and contain. This dynamic is not unique to Enoch. It appears in parallel in the Apocalypse of John, an accepted canonical text, where the final judgment is preceded by progressive moral collapse and accelerated social disintegration. It appears in multiple Jewish apocalyptic texts from the intertestamental period, where the end times arise precisely when corruption reaches an absolutely unsustainable limit. It appears in ancient Sumerian and Babylonian traditions, where creator gods regret having granted knowledge and abilities to humans. The Mesopotamian flood narrated in the Epic of Gilgamesh is not divine punishment for abstract human wickedness. It is a desperate response to a world where humans have become dangerous and uncontrollable, where the chaos generated by human action threatens the very established cosmic order, where creation turns destructively against itself. The next passage connects everything and is rarely discussed seriously. Because what these ancient narratives preserve is not necessarily literal factual history of angels and giants, it is deep cultural memory of recurring civilizational crises. Crises where technological advancement dramatically surpasses ethical capacity, where power becomes completely dissociated from responsibility, where knowledge becomes intrinsically destructive because it was accessed or developed without adequate moral preparation. These narratives were banished by official religious canons because they forced questions without comfortable theological answers. If God is absolutely good and all-powerful, why does He allow destructive knowledge to be accessed? If humanity is divine creation made in God's image, why is it so structurally prone to moral collapse? If knowledge liberates and enlightens, Why does it so often enslave and destroy? If power empowers and elevates, why does it so frequently corrupt and annihilate? The early church, in defining the official biblical canon in its councils, deliberately opted for narratives that offered theological clarity and doctrinal simplicity. God creates with purpose. Humanity falls through disobedience. Christ redeems through sacrifice. Individual faith saves. A linear, comprehensible, institutionally controllable structure. Enoch and the banned texts offered something radically different. They offered irreducible complexity, profound moral ambiguity, shared responsibility between the divine and the human, gods who fail to control creation, angels who transgress direct orders, humans who consistently choose poorly, even knowing the consequences, knowledge that corrupts structurally, power that inevitably destroys, judgment that purifies but does not restore lost innocence. This did not fit comfortably into the consolidating theological structure. That is why it was systematically left out. Not because it was demonstrably a historical lie, but because it was deeply uncomfortable for religious authority. Now we arrive at the final part of the script, the most impactful. Because everything developed so far is not ancient history disconnected from the present. It's not archaeological curiosity. It's not abstract theological speculation. It's a precise description of a pattern that continues to operate actively. The narrative of Enoch speaks of knowledge granted before the morally appropriate time. Today, in the 21st century, humanity accesses knowledge on a scale, speed, and depth absolutely unprecedented in recorded history. Artificial intelligence capable of generating texts indistinguishable from humans, fake photorealistic images, complex functional codes. Biotechnology capable of precisely editing the human genome, creating synthetic organisms, modifying heredity. Nanotechnology capable of manipulating matter at the atomic and molecular level. Quantum computing capable of breaking cryptographic systems that underpin the entire global digital infrastructure. Surveillance technology capable of tracking every movement, every communication, every transaction. Autonomous weapons capable of selecting and eliminating targets without human intervention. This knowledge is no longer restricted to controlled academic institutions or national governments. It is dispersed, accessible, accelerating exponentially. The question Enoch poses directly and brutally is, are we prepared? Do we have a developed collective moral structure to deal with what we now know how to do technically? Do we have accumulated wisdom to contain the destructive use of what we have created? Do we have functional ethical institutions to regulate application? Or are we simply repeating the old pattern, receiving technical power, applying power immediately, disseminating power without control, without ever seriously asking whether we should? The ancient narrative preserved in Enoch did not fear knowledge in itself. It specifically feared knowledge dissociated from wisdom. It feared technical power dissociated from functional ethics. It feared technical capability completely dissociated from corresponding moral responsibility. And this documented fear was not irrational or superstitious. It was based on repeated historical observation. Every time humanity gained access to significant new power, there was massive destruction before institutional control. Fire allowed cooking food and burning entire cities. Metallurgy allowed agricultural tools and weapons of war. Gunpowder allowed mining and cannons. Nuclear energy allowed abundant electricity and thermonuclear bombs. Biotechnology enables the cure of diseases and irreversible genetic manipulation. The pattern is crystal clear when observed historically. Radically new knowledge generates massive destructive application before generating wise and sustainable use. Because wisdom is a slow process. Ethics is socially constructed, over generations, through trial and error. Technical capability is a rapid process. It can be developed, tested, and disseminated globally in a few years. The gap between what we know how to do technically and what we collectively know we should do ethically is increasing exponentially. And this is not unfounded modern alarmism. It is not technophobic paranoia. It is the same structural warning that runs through Enoch, Genesis, Jubilees, Jewish apocalyptic texts, Mesopotamian creation myths. Civilizational collapse begins precisely when technical capability brutally surpasses moral maturity, when power grows exponentially faster than responsibility, when knowledge becomes completely dissociated from practical wisdom. Enoch was historically banished because this portrayal of humanity was deeply disturbing to religious authorities. It unequivocally showed that the problem doesn't just come from outside, from evil external demonic forces. It's not just supernatural entities corrupting innocent humanity. The problem is inscribed in the very fundamental human disposition to use what one shouldn't use, in the structural inability to refuse offered power, in the psychological compulsion to know without ever questioning whether that knowledge will be applied wisely. The narrative doesn't offer an easy and comfortable solution. It doesn't say we can simply stop seeking new knowledge, because realistically, we can't. Curiosity is a constitutive part of human nature. The impulse to know, to dominate, to control, to expand capabilities is deeply inscribed in the species. But the narrative clearly warns that this impulse, without internal moral restraint, inevitably leads to collapse, and that the necessary restraint needs to be fundamentally internal, ethical, moral, cultural, not merely technical or external regulatory. This is precisely what makes the text genuinely disturbing for power structures, because there is no possible technical solution to an essentially moral problem. There is no algorithm that solves ethical responsibility. There is no technology that replaces accumulated wisdom. There is no external regulation that forces ethical behavior without internal adherence. The only realistic way to avoid civilizational collapse is through developed collective maturity. The cultural capacity to say no to one's own power, to refuse the application of destructive knowledge, to voluntarily limit the use of technical capabilities, to systematically ask not only if we can technically do something, but if we should ethically do it. And this collective moral capacity needs to grow at the same exponential rate as technical knowledge. If it does not grow proportionally, the historical pattern inevitably repeats itself. Knowledge without wisdom, power without ethics, capacity without limit, and collapse as a structurally inevitable consequence. The banned texts carefully preserved this cultural memory. They preserved the fundamental warning, not as a literal, supernatural, apocalyptic end-of-the-world prophecy, but as an observational description of a recurring historical pattern. A pattern that can be consciously avoided, but only if it is recognized first. Only if it is taken seriously institutionally. Only if humanity collectively decides that moral maturity matters as much as technical ability, that practical wisdom matters as much as theoretical knowledge, that functional ethics matter as much as brute power. The texts were banned precisely because this message did not fit comfortably into the narrative of automatic redemption through faith. It did not fit into the comforting idea that religious belief solves everything on its own. It did not allow for easy institutional comfort. It demanded constant confrontation. It demanded personal and collective responsibility. It demanded recognizing that humanity has an absolutely active role in its own civilizational destiny, and that this role can consciously lead to restoration or collapse, depending entirely on how it is exercised. Enoch walked with God and was taken alive. He did not die. He did not experience decay. He did not pass through death like everyone else. He crossed the threshold. He surpassed the border between the human and the divine while still breathing. This singularity is not a minor narrative detail. It is the symbolic axis of the entire warning. Enoch is not merely a righteous man. He is a witness to something that could not be communicated in any other way. He received direct revelation, not as an individual spiritual privilege, but as a collective historical burden. And what he brought was not comfort. It was not an easy promise. It was a warning. This warning doesn't speak of supernatural monsters in the folkloric sense. It doesn't speak of fantastic creatures to entertain religious imagination. It doesn't speak of empty mythology. It speaks of structures. It speaks of patterns. It speaks of ourselves. It speaks of what inevitably happens when human beings learn to do too much before learning to be. When technical capacity grows faster than moral maturity. When power expands at an exponential rate while wisdom advances slowly, almost imperceptibly. What Enoch describes is not an isolated accident from the distant past. It is a recurring mechanism. It is what happens structurally when we are technically too capable without being ethically mature enough to bear the weight of what we do. When the question, how, becomes infinitely more important than the question, should we? When application precedes understanding, when use precedes reflection, when advancement happens without internal restraint. This warning has spanned millennia. It has survived for over 3,000 years, not because it was protected by the victors of history, but despite them. It survived in scattered fragments, in incomplete translations, in peripheral communities, in marginalized religious traditions, in manuscripts hidden in caves, in forgotten languages, in rejected canons. It survived because it never ceased to be true, because it never ceased to be relevant, because the pattern described never ceased. It was never resolved. It only reappeared in new forms, with new technologies, with new names. The texts were banned, not forgotten, not completely destroyed. Banned. That's different. To ban is to acknowledge the danger of an idea and decide that it should not circulate freely. And they weren't banned because they lied about historical facts. They weren't banned because they were late inventions or documentary frauds. They were banned because they said too much about who we fundamentally are, because they exposed something that institutions prefer to keep hidden. Our structural inability to contain the impulse for power. Our profound psychological difficulty in refusing destructive knowledge when it is offered. Our civilizational tendency to immediately apply what we do not yet fully understand. Enoch reveals something profoundly unsettling. He reveals that evil is not merely something that attacks us from the outside. It is not simply an external force that passively corrupts us. He reveals that there is within us an active disposition to use what we do not know how to control. An almost automatic compulsion to experiment, test, apply, explore, even when the consequences are unknown, even when the risks are evident. He reveals that humanity is not merely a victim of collapse. It is a central agent of it. This is not religious doctrine. It is not theological dogma. It is not a modern conspiracy theory. It is not fear manufactured by apocalyptic alarmism. It is an observable historical pattern. It is documented repetition. It is a cultural warning preserved over time because it was written into human experience itself. And this pattern continues to operate today with unprecedented intensity. Fundamental human nature hasn't changed. What has changed is the context. What has changed is the scale. What has changed is the speed. Technology has advanced radically. The power available to individuals and institutions has grown exponentially. The capacity to transform the world and to destroy it has never been greater. But collective moral maturity has not kept pace with this growth. Ethical wisdom has not advanced at the same rate. Civilizational responsibility has not evolved at the same speed. The outcome is predictable. It always has been. Knowledge without wisdom leads to collapse. Not through arbitrary divine punishment, not through supernatural retribution, but through inevitable structural consequences. Power without ethics breeds destruction. Unlimited capacity leads to rupture. Technology without conscience generates chaos. This is not a mystical warning. It is a historical observation. Enoch does not offer a simple solution. He does not promise automatic redemption. He does not say that simply believing is enough to escape. He presents a choice, implicit but inescapable. Unless we consciously choose differently, unless we collectively decide that moral maturity matters as much as innovation, that functional ethics matter as much as efficiency, that civilizational responsibility matters as much as progress. The texts were banned centuries ago, but the warning they carry has never been erased, never been neutralized, never been overcome. On the contrary, it has never been so urgent, never been so relevant, never been so impossible to ignore as it is now.